Hi there, all you beautiful internet people. Today, I'm going to be talking about Adult Swim, the famous cable network operated by Time Warner. And this is going to be an extremely negative and controversial video, so buckle up your seatbelts because I'm about to go in hard on Adult Swim here. For a long time now, I've been critical of Adult Swim and their effects on the American animation industry, and I have faced a lot of backlash for that because I understand that a lot of people have some kind of deep-seated emotional connection or something to the network. But as someone with no real emotional investment in any particular media property that I'm not responsible for the creation of, because I think standing a cable network is weird behavior, I have zero investment in whether Adult Swim lives or dies. I'd prefer if it died. But today I'm going to present my case to you as to why I think Adult Swim is one of the worst cable networks of all time, and precisely why I think it's bad for the state of American animation in the present, and why I don't like it. Let's get into this hot steaming baked potato and check it out, huh?
All kids out of the pool for Adult Swim.
I've talked at length before about how awful Adult Swim's comedy is.
We have prices discount.
This is mainly because I grew up watching real comedians like Dana Carvey, Phil Hartman, George Carlin, that bunch. And the new breed, Tim Heidecker, Eric Wareheim, Eric Andre, that sort, I think they're ridiculously unfunny. In this video, though, I want to focus specifically on the cartoon side of Adult Swim and what that means for modern and contemporary animation. I do think that there was a time in the early 2000s, obviously I was way too young to remember this, but I do think there was a time, from what I've seen, when Adult Swim could genuinely be considered a boundary-pushing network. You had shows like The Venture Bros, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Space Ghost Coast to Coast. I think that this first generation of Adult Swim shows was legitimately interesting and groundbreaking for its time. Because, in essence, these shows did things that few other shows would dare attempt. And I will acknowledge the historical importance of that in the 2000s. But I cannot make the case that Adult Swim has done anything boundary-pushing since, I suppose, the time Aqua Teen Hunger Force ended. I don't think Adult Swim has done anything that can be considered emblematic of the medium of animation today. Now, I've used this analogy quite a bit with people. If Hot Topic is a fake goth shop that most of the real goths avoid because it's cringy, then Adult Swim is the Hot Topic of animation, and real animators stay away from Adult Swim because it's the most commodified bargain bin gutter garbage that's shoved out by a giant media conglomerate. Back in the 1980s, I think people were still smart enough to recognize that MTV was not a countercultural juggernaut, but a very mainstream pop-oriented sound, which is why punk bands like the Dead Kennedys made songs like MTV Get Off the Air, because they were sick of this shit. You know, MTV has a laundry list of offenses that you could put against it, such as how they were racist and refused to allow Michael Jackson on their network initially. These days, we tend to suckle up to Hulu and Netflix and Adult Swim, and I don't think there's been a backlash on the level that the Dead Kennedys dished out against MTV back in the 1980s. Even though Netflix and Adult Swim and these other giant media monopolies arguably have much of a worse impact on popular entertainment than MTV could even possibly hope to aspire. Like most media conglomerates and giant corporatized nonsense, Adult Swim presents itself as some kind of countercultural movement, when in fact, it's about as mainstream as you can get. Ask yourself, what's the definition of going mainstream in animation today? You can't get much more mainstream than freaking Rick and Morty, the same network that airs the most popular cartoon of the 2010s, Probably going to be the most popular cartoon of the 2020s too, but that's besides the point. My point is that animation works best when it's against the mainstream. Generally, people with a modicum of artistic talent or integrity stay as far away from Adult Swim as possible. This is in part because Adult Swim is operated by Time Warner, a giant media subsidiary, and nothing you get out of that is going to be even remotely countercultural, but also because in California, and that falls prey to the kind of nepotism and hegemony that California is known for. They would probably give a show to the janitor who works at the Time Warner offices before they'd give me, a Coloradan, the option to speak out or voice my opinion or make a show of my own. Because California generally is known for its monopoly on entertainment, and Adult Swim is nothing if not a monopoly on animation. A good example of Adult Swim's horrible taste is when they rejected MF Doom's show The Missing Notebook Rhymes, so only half the show came out, disrespecting one of the greatest rappers of all time. I can definitely see why MF Doom and Adult Swim had creative differences. But like, holy shit, imagine being so tone deaf that, like, you cancel half of the show of this fantastic rapper who's one of the best ever. Be really fucking stupid to do that. But then again, Adult Swim isn't actually in touch with the youth of today, and I think it's high time we put that into perspective. Now, I'm actually a huge fan of what might be termed adult animation, although I disagree with that term because generally when I think adult animation, I think a pornographic cartoon, and certainly not all adult animated movies are pornographic in nature. A lot of them would just be considered rated R by film standards, so I'm not sure why adult animation is the term we go with. And I think to call something like Brickleberry or Paradise PD or Rick and Morty adult animation is giving them a little too much fucking credit. And I think the best of adult animation, or really just competent animation, I think Ralph Bakshi. Every single Ralph Bakshi film is a fucking delight. Even the less well-received ones, like Hey Good Lookin', which is a film that supposedly wasn't even completed and had entire chunks just ripped out. That thing looks 100 times better than Rick and Morty. No, 1,000,000 times better. Has way better characters, way better pacing, way better choreography, way better set design. That thing looks incredible. And to think that Ralph Bakshi just draws this shit, you know, he and his team just go out the storyboards, draw this shit with a bunch of pencils, it's fantastic. Good example of an animated film that I think can be called competent, much more competent than Rick and Morty, would be 1992's Cool World. Not only is the cast stellar, you have Brad Pitt and Kim Basinger, I think the movie is often shit upon by the same sort of people who are apt to enjoy Rick and Morty without realizing that Cool World could kick Rick and Morty's ass any day of the week. Cool World is a fantastic film. I would definitely recommend it for anyone interested in getting into cartoons or getting into animation and checking out what can be done with the medium of animation. But for whatever reason, we tend to reject actual good films like Cool World. Meanwhile, we prop up shit like Rick and Morty, and I think that's a problem. People have often observed, why is American animation dying? Some people call animation Eastern and Western, but I disagree fundamentally with that terminology because it's not the Roman Empire anymore, and you can't divide the world up into East and West when there's also South America and Africa and Australia, a bunch of other continents that don't fit that definition. I think it's much more accurate to call cartoons, or any piece of media for that matter, the country where they originate from instead of Eastern and Western, because these terms don't exist. And I think much like Oriental and Occidental, they're like archaic. I don't know why we're still referring to Western and Eastern. For instance, when dealing with real cartoons, like say something from the Film Board of Canada, which I think is one of the most respectable institutions in animation today, and they've been knocking it out of the park since the 1960s. You look at the Film Board of Canada and some of the pieces they've made, like the Log Driver's Waltz, or there's a pin screen animation they made, which is fantastic. But it's very different from American animation in a lot of fundamental ways. A Canadian cartoon is instantly recognizable and distinguishable from an American cartoon. Just because Canada and America have irreconcilable cultural differences that are going to make a Canadian cartoon feel different from an American cartoon, which in turn will feel different from a Mexican cartoon, which in turn will feel different from a Brazilian cartoon. And by that same token, a Korean cartoon will feel different from a Chinese cartoon, which is going to feel different from a Vietnamese cartoon, which in turn is going to feel different from a Japanese cartoon. Different countries produce different types of stuff, and that's okay. Diversity is good, but I don't think you can chunk animation into Eastern and Western. If all you mean is America and Asia, then just say, this cartoon's American or this cartoon's Korean. I really don't get the need to act as if America and Japan are the only two countries that exist, because that's obviously not the case. Regardless, a lot of people seem to have been pointing out that Western animation, as they call it, not as I call it, is dying. And they wonder what the reason for this is. I would place the death of Western animation, or American animation, firmly on the shoulders of Adult Swim, because in effect they have created a monopoly around animation. Let's think back to the golden age of animation, the 1940s, back when cartoons were serious business and people took them seriously to put out the most quality product possible. You had MGM with Tom and Jerry, a fantastic cartoon. You had Warner Brothers with Looney Tunes, which have easily stood the test of time. Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd and all those other hilarious, well-rounded characters are as cool today as they were over 70 years ago. Then, of course, you had Disney, which was chugging out garbage, anti-union, fascist propaganda, because Walt Disney was a real scuzzball. But you get the point. There were obviously a lot of companies putting out cartoons at the same time, in the same given period. This created healthy competition. These days I see a ton of videos about Moral Orel talking about how it's an underrated masterpiece. But what I say is, if you're on Adult Swim, you don't have the right to call yourself an underrated masterpiece. I would call Hey Good Lookin an underrated masterpiece because very few people have seen it. Very few people understand the genius and talent that goes into it. But I wouldn't call this half-hearted David and Goliath ripoff Moral Orel any kind of underrated masterpiece. I'm not even religious, but I can appreciate the talent that Art Clokey put into David and Goliath. I mean, the charm that he put into Gumby is still there. Even though David and Goliath isn't the craziest cartoon, it doesn't have the craziest messages, I'm going to say that it's better than Moral Orel, because all Moral Orel does is just take a massive shit on that style of animation. Anyone who says anything from Adult Swim is underrated doesn't seem to understand how the system of overrated and underrated works. When you're on a national cable channel, you lose the right to call yourself underrated because you're reaching more American homes than most cartoons and most animators could possibly hope to do in their lives. I think a lot of people take that kind of exposure for granted, but if you're on a national cable TV network, you're not underrated. Not even close. Why are people calling Moral Orel underrated? Maybe it's because an edgy parody spoof of a religious cartoon like David and Goliath or Gerbert or Bible Man is considered transgressive and provocative these days, particularly by atheists who used to be religious but then grew out of it and now face an existential crisis at the godlessness of the universe. I, however, am an atheist who never believed in God and finds church and all that stuff boring and lame. And so, when I see Moral Orel, all I see is a shitty cartoon about a religion that I don't care about and have no investment in. And so I think a show like Moral Orel is really boring because nothing interesting happens in it. Compare this to a classic cartoon, like The Roadrunner. Think about how much they're able to stuff into just like 6 minutes of solid, jam-packed, fun animation. The Roadrunner just running around, and Wile E. Coyote shoots at him with rockets and shit. You're not going to see anything that entertaining on Adult Swim. I can guarantee that. Much of Adult Swim shtick, from its early days, has been the appropriation of the classic Hanna-Barbera and Looney Tunes characters, to the point where they just have them walk on stage and say the N-word and then leave. And that might have been considered transgressive and interesting 20 years ago, when nobody knew that since Time Warner owned the rights to all these famous cartoon characters, they could do whatever they wanted with them and bastardize the memory of Chuck Jones and Hanna-Barbera. But these days, there's nothing new or interesting about that. It's Adult Swim's only trick at this point. You can just have Fred Flintstone walk on stage and say the F-word and then leave, and that's not interesting. There's nothing to that. You're not creating a cartoon that's as memorable or fun as the Flintstones was back in the 60s, and nobody is going to give a shit. I guarantee, in 50 years, nobody is going to remember Moral Orel or even Aqua Teen Hunger Force, probably, the same way we remember Scooby-Doo and the Flintstones and Looney Tunes today. Because Moral Orel does not have the type of staying power, the kind of universal charm and appeal that a character like Daffy Duck does. He just doesn't, because he's invented as a mean-spirited parody of something that fundamentally is boring to parody. I find the dichotomy between American animation and Japanese animation pretty interesting, truth be told. And contrary to popular belief, I have watched some anime. I saw Astro Boy on VHS when I was young, and I thought it was an awful cartoon, nowhere near as good as Looney Tunes. There's one anime I saw, Belladonna of Sadness, which I thought was really good, and I probably would include in my top 10 list of animated movies. The question these days is, why is anime from Japan outperforming American cartoons? I think the answer is pretty simple. Japan has more than one animation company, and they draw their cartoons. They don't outsource their cartoons to a foreign country like Rick and Morty does. They draw their own shit, and that's respectable for the most part. Rick and Morty doesn't even draw its own shit. They just outsource the work to Canada because it's cheaper, and the result is a weird cultural amalgamation that makes no sense.
Hey, you guys want to stack Pringles flavors? Hey, you guys want to stack Pringles flavors?
I can see why a lot of people might watch a cartoon like Spirited Away over Rick and Morty. Adult Swim is an outdated concept at this point, kind of like the Tom Green Show or The Man Show. If you remember The Man Show from the early 2000s and late 90s, hosted by Jimmy Kimmel and Adam Carolla, I think that's the same kind of cultural artifact that Adult Swim is. It's old hat at this point. And to think that we're still worshipping this 20-year-old company that was a product of its time back in the early 2000s when having Space Ghost say the F-word was transgressive and edgy, it kind of speaks to just how much we've stagnated culturally, at least as far as cartoons go. I think animation is fantastic. It's an extremely respectable industry, and as someone who's dabbled in it myself, I understand the intricacies of it to the extent that I think Adult Swim is a network bereft of ideas, and they chug out garbage because it's the only thing they really have left at this point. They are a soulless corporate hybrid that has about as much ingenuity or talent as a Ritz cracker. Anyone who's actually going to be considered part of the upcoming countercultural movement will not be working at Adult Swim. A lot of people have praised Smiling Friends as a breath of fresh air to the network, that the creators of the show are completely in tune with the sensibilities of the internet. But what I say is, if they were actually that much in touch, they wouldn't be putting their show on Adult Swim. They just upload it to the internet. A lot of people have said, well, Smiling Friends is too edgy to be on YouTube. You can buy your own website and upload it there. I'm sure these guys have enough money to do that. It's not like nobody would watch it. If it's that great a show, people will watch it. But if you're putting your show on Adult Swim, you're not that in touch. Sorry. I'd argue I'm much more in touch with the sensibilities of the modern day than either of the guys who made Smiling Friends. When I look at Smiling Friends, I don't see some kind of avant-garde masterpiece. I see something that's trying to look like those old Little Men and Mr. Miss books that you used to see in kindergarten, and I'll admit it does look a lot like that, but the style certainly isn't anything new. I've seen it before. I think Adult Swim is a massive embarrassment to American animation, and it's mainly the reason why American cartoons are losing out to anime. If American animation is to survive, we'll need to stop being edgy and start making cartoons that are as memorable and interesting and nuanced as the Flintstones was, or heck, even as nuanced and interesting as The Simpsons was. I think The Simpsons is a fantastic cartoon, at least for the first couple seasons. A crazy respectable show. But these days, every show tries to be The Simpsons, and it's not the 90s anymore. You can't just be The Simpsons. Do something new, for fuck's sake. How many times are we going to get Family Guy, and Brickleberry, and Rick and Morty, and Hoops, and all these shitty Simpsons ripoffs? Not all of which are on Adult Swim, of course, but you get the point. It's a cycle where nothing new is created. Going back to my earlier point about the Film Board of Canada and how they're responsible for some of the most innovative animation of the past 50 years, I think they're a very good example of how to do cartoons right. Every segment by the Film Board of Canada, every animated segment feels completely different. Stylistically, in message and tone, they just feel so different, but also so well made. It's insane to think that Canadian cartoons are better than American cartoons, but I have to hand it to Canada. Canadian cartoons kick ass, especially from the Film Board of Canada, like I said. Canada has respect for animation, and the fact that people aren't utilizing the magic of animation to its full potential, the brilliance of still images coming alive and jumping off the page right at you, it's a real shame, because if properly handled, animation can be visually compelling. It can be fantastic, and people should watch more stuff like Ralph Bakshi films, like Cool World or The Lord of the Rings, to get a good idea of how animation is actually supposed to look if it's handled by people who know what they're doing and are trying to make a competent product, instead of a shitty option buyout streaming service sellout show that's going to last for one season and then get booted, but they made money off it so they don't care, because who cares about quality when you can make that bag from Hulu or whatnot. Adult Swim and their system of just having Fred Flintstone come on and say something vulgar and then leave is no longer viable in 2023. It's not interesting anymore, it's not fun, there's nothing new about it. Let's stop and let's actually consider that with animation you can do a lot of different cool new things and a lot of cool new different techniques, and that's why animators here on the internet, especially like small ones, produce way better cartoons than Adult Swim could ever possibly hope to. I see so much dedication and passion just here on the internet from people who, heck, don't even get paid half the time, who just draws a stick figure on a sticky note and do some shit with it. There's more innovation here on the internet than on Adult Swim. I'm sure that back in the 90s when South Park came on and you heard Cartman say shit for the first time, it was probably hilarious. But we don't live in that time anymore. Maybe there will come another time in the far future when having a cartoon character say profanity is funny. But for the time being, unless that profanity is narratively justified, it's not enough to just have Wile E. Coyote come in dressed as an Al-Qaeda member. That's not going to cut it. So here's my message to Adult Swim. You had a good run, but you're dead and irrelevant now, and it's high time that animators have other options and other resources and other places that they can option their show to than you. We need more diversity in the animation sector like Japan has. They have multiple different animation studios running around the clock. If American animation is going to be taken seriously again as a medium, the solution is not to idolize or worship Adult Swim. The solution is to reject everything that Adult Swim stands for and create your own product. out of your own intention and your own interests. That said, to usher in the exciting post-Adult Swim age, I've created an album called Adult Swamp that I'm going to be releasing soon. It's a fantastic album with 22 tracks, all of which I think are solid bangers. It's a concept album about a cable network similar to Adult Swim, which airs garbage content 24/7, and people get really sick of it. It's a concept album to rival The Wall or A Night at the Opera, and it's coming out on April 20th. That's right, my birthday. So watch out for that. It's going to blow the cover wide open. Anyway, until next time, that's just generally my basic thoughts on Adult Swim, their method of animation, how old and stale it is at this point, and why I don't get the hype around Adult Swim. I don't get why people worship this company. It's the same kind of weird cult mentality I see surrounding Tesla and shit. It's like there's no need to simp for a company this hard, you know? It's not interesting. Anyway, that'll do it for this video. I'm out. Moral Oral can screw out, and yeah, that's it for this video. Adult Swim, get off the air.